Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania. Senator, that was the midnight shift. You spoke for about 45 minutes. Are you with us? Are you awake? How are you feeling? And also, are you pulling another all-nighter tonight? Because we're just getting word this afternoon that perhaps the Democrats are thinking about doing this again, a talkathon in protest of the Attorney General nominee, Jeff Sessions. Is that the case?
Yeah, well, I think we'll be doing this on a number of the nominations to be able to use the full extent of our time. And I'll tell you what, despite the fact that Betsy DeVos was confirmed, to have the vice president have to appear there, I think was an indication that all of the work that was done across the country by people, some people who have never been involved in government issues or debating public policy or opposing a cabinet nominee, all that work was bearing a lot of fruit in the end. And I think it's a good template for what we have to do. Asking tough questions, demanding answers, and holding these nominees accountable in the nomination process. So I think despite the fact that she was confirmed, this was a process that involved a lot of Americans. Just in my office, for example, 100,000 contacts just in my office, just on this DeVos nomination.
And how many of those were pro or con? Were most of them against her, or were some pro?
It was about 90-10 against.
Okay. Not a single Democratic senator voted to confirm her. Republicans and supporters, as you know, have said for days, we've had many guests here on my show saying she has extensive experience in Michigan. They've been running ads. I saw one this morning saying that what she will do is provide options and choices, particularly for low-income children who have schools that aren't working for them. Families in places like Philadelphia, which you represent. What about that argument that she's going to shake things up and give people choices?
Well, look, I come from a state where we have 92% of our school children enrolled in traditional public schools. We should be focused on their needs in those schools and what those children need. And I would hope we would have a Secretary of Education who's a champion for those schools and those children. Now, in our state, we do have charter schools, but they're public, nonprofit charter schools. We don't allow for-profit charter schools, and I would hope that would be the policy going forward for every state, but of course right now it's not. We need a champion for public education, and I asked her questions as well about protecting women on college and university campuses against sexual assault. She wouldn't even commit to me to enforce the current law and also to embrace the guidance that the Department of Education put in place under 2 presidential administrations. I would hope that she would finally have an answer to protect young women on college campuses to the full extent of the law and hold perpetrators accountable, and of course to support our public schools.
Senator, you just mentioned a few moments ago that Democrats are going to continue to try to drag things out, maybe spend another all-nighter tonight. The press secretary at the White House, Sean Spicer, was asked about your tactics today, about Democrats and the confirmation process, and he had some sharp words. I want to play what he said and then get your response.
The fact that we had to get to the point where the vice president had to be pulled in to overcome the Democrats' historic and partisan logjam of the president's qualified nominee is another glaring reminder of the unprecedented obstruction that Senate Democrats have engaged in throughout this process. I think it's interesting that we're focusing on the votes of 2 Republicans when you look at the spectrum of antics that have gone on in the Democrats. I mean, the tactics that they have done over and over and over again to delay, not show up to hearings, do filibuster to the extent that they can, run the clock out. It's not Republicans that have a problem here, Alexis. It's the Democrats that continue to do this.
Your response, Senator?
Well, he must have been sleeping through the last number of years where Republicans filibustered more than any group of senators in American history by far. But here's the point that he misses. He should read the Constitution. The Constitution says the Senate shall advise and consent. That means you use your time, all of your time, if necessary, to ask questions, get answers. The problem here was you had a nominee that was not qualified. You had a nominee that had all kinds of financial conflicts of interest or potential conflicts of interest, and you had a nominee whose whole adult life was spent opposing or undermining public education. Her whole education advocacy and her political advocacy was about privatizing public education. It was so extensive that in my sit down with her, we had a good discussion. It was very respectful. But I said to her at one point, almost out of exasperation, you were not going to be the secretary of private education. You're going to be the Secretary of Education. You need to fight on behalf of public schools. I hope she'll do that as Secretary.
Let me ask you about one other issue, Senator, because you're on the Health Committee up in the Senate. Sean Spicer was asked about Obamacare and how quickly they plan to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, because the president, in his interview on Super Bowl Sunday, indicated that it might be a year before they have a replacement plan. What is your sense from your colleagues on your side of the aisle and from the Republicans you work with on how quickly things are going to change for Americans?
Well, look, health care and the solutions to providing more access to health care, quality health care, all of the things that we had to wrestle with in the lead up to the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, it's difficult work and it's serious business. I wish Republicans spent a lot more time in the last 7 years, instead of just talking about repeal, working on their alternative. They haven't. They have no idea how they're going to replace this. Now they're using words like repair. What they should do is set aside this maniacal obsession with repeal and sit down with us to try to improve the Affordable Care Act. They don't want to do that because they just want a political trophy for very extreme points of view across the country. And that's, I think, unfortunate, because we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we ensure that the protections for 175 million Americans who get employer-sponsored coverage for pre-existing conditions and protections for children and families, to make sure that those protections stay in place. I would hope they would work with us on that instead of pretending that they have a solution to this or an alternative, which they don't have.
Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, a Democrat, thanks for being with us.